December 17th, 1944. The world is wrapped in winter. Across the darkened forests of eastern Belgium, a white silence hangs like breath before dawn. Frost clings to pine branches, the air so cold that each exhale turns to crystal mist. Beneath that frozen stillness, an army waits, steel monsters and weary men crouched at the edge of history's final gamble. The Tiger tank's engine coughed once, then again, then died. In the dim half-light its massive silhouette stood motionless, steam rising gently from the armored beast. Inside, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper slammed his fist against the turret wall, the metallic echo cutting through the stillness like a church bell. His driver, Unteroffizier Werner Wöhr, twisted the starter again. Nothing. The Maybach engine, the pride of German engineering, had run dry. The fuel gauge needle lay flat against the bottom. Not a drop remained. From below, his radio operator's voice wavered upward, brittle with disbelief. The reserve tank, too. Empty. Peiper climbed down, boots crunching on the frozen soil. The dawn was still hours away, but the faintest blush of gray crept over the horizon. He looked around him at what should have been a hammer blow of German might. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, nearly 5,000 Waffen-SS soldiers, the most powerful armored spearhead Germany could muster. Yet here they sat, silent and cold, their engines lifeless in the snow. Before him lay the small Belgian village of Honsfeld. The Americans had abandoned it only hours earlier. Fires still flickered in oil drums beside shattered windows. Tin cups sat half buried in snow, their contents still steaming. Somewhere a phonograph played, its record skipping endlessly on the same note, a fragile trace of the lives that had just fled. And beyond that, in neat, astonishing rows, Peiper saw them. Olive-drab cans, stacked 3 meters high and stretching as far as he could see. Jerry cans, thousands upon thousands of them. He moved closer, hardly daring to breathe. His adjutant, Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruber, pried one open and took a cautious sniff. "High octane," he murmured. Peiper said nothing. His men set to work at once, the air soon filled with the hiss of siphons and the scent of gasoline. Flames of excitement crackled among them. Fuel, the miracle they had prayed for. Peiper stood amid it all, counting silently. 50,000 gallons. Enough to drive his entire battle group to the Meuse River. Enough, perhaps, to turn the tide of a war that had already turned against them. But as he watched his soldiers pour American gasoline into German tanks, another thought, colder and heavier, began to settle over him. If the Americans could abandon such wealth, he realized, if they could leave behind what Germany would guard with divisions, then the war was already lost. 6 months earlier, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, had placed a report on the Führer's desk that should have ended all offensive dreams. Allied bombers had reduced Germany's synthetic fuel plants to rubble. In April, they had produced 175,000 tons of fuel. By September, barely 5,000. The hydrogenation plants at Politz, Leuna, and Bleckhammer were wrecked. Germany's engines of war were starving. In contrast, across the Atlantic, the United States was drowning in oil. In 1944 alone, America produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude, more than 50 times Germany's total. Fields in Texas and Oklahoma pumped day and night, feeding a continent-sized machine. Synthetic fuel, captured stockpiles, Romanian oil, all combined. The Reich AS total equaled less than 2% of what the United States could summon with ease. The German army, built for mechanized blitzkrieg, now marched behind horses. Peiper knew the arithmetic. He was no fool. At 29, he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS, a soldier forged on the Eastern Front, hardened by the brutal winters of Russia. He understood that in modern war, fuel was not just supply, it was life itself. 2 days earlier, at a final briefing in Tondorf, General Sepp Dietrich had been blunt. "You have enough fuel to reach the Meuse," he told Peiper, "if you capture American supplies." The allocation for Peiper's Kampfgruppe was 31,000 gallons, barely enough for 50 miles of advance. The distance to the Meuse was 65. Failure had been written into the plan from the beginning, and yet they had begun. December 16th. Dawn broke beneath the thunder of artillery. Operation Wacht am Rhine, Watch on the Rhine, Germany's last great gamble in the West. The guns roared for 2 hours, consuming more shells than entire campaigns earlier in the war. But even that spectacular barrage hid a grim truth. The reserves were nearly gone. At 0700 hours, Peiper's column rolled forward into the mist. The maps had promised broad highways. Instead, they found narrow country lanes, choked with mud and snow. Heavy tanks built for the Russian steppe struggled up icy inclines. Within hours, the grand offensive dissolved into snarled convoys and clogged roads. Soldiers pushed stalled trucks by hand while engines idled, burning precious gallons. At the hamlet of Lanzerath, they met their first resistance. Just 18 American reconnaissance men from the 99th Infantry Division. 18 against thousands. Yet those 18 delayed Peiper's advance for 10 hours, buying time with courage and frostbitten fingers. When the Germans finally broke through, they had burned nearly half their fuel. By dawn, on the 17th, as the first pale light touched the rooftops of Hansfeld, Peiper's tanks had covered only 20 miles. Their gauges hovered near empty. When the engines began to sputter, his driver's voice came trembling through the intercom. "Herr Obersturmbannführer, the tank is finished." And then the miracle of the jerry cans. As the tanks refueled, the men discovered the Americans had left not a token cache, but a treasure beyond belief. Shipping manifests lay scattered in the depot office, half buried under snow. One soldier, Wilhelm Hoffmann, who had worked in his father's import business before the war, picked them up. He could read English. The papers traced a staggering journey. Fuel, drawn from the wells of Texas, refined in New York, shipped across the Atlantic to Liverpool, piped under the Channel to Normandy, and trucked 400 miles to Belgium, all in less than 6 weeks. Hoffmann carried the papers to Peiper. The young commander read them twice, then slowly crumpled them in his gloved hand. His face turned pale. "We cannot win," Hoffmann later remembered him saying. Nearby, Private Ernst Kara found a stack of newspapers. Stars and Stripes, dated only 2 days earlier. The headline announced the opening of a new pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, capable of delivering 300,000 gallons per day. A single pipeline, more fuel each day than Peiper's entire force would use in the whole offensive. For the men of Kampfgruppe Peiper, the truth came like an avalanche. They had been sent to seize what America had in abundance. Their miracle depot was not even a major base, just a forward post, one of hundreds strung across the countryside. And yet, in that moment, surrounded by captured fuel, they felt both triumphant and condemned. From above, the sky began to lighten. A colorless dawn spreading across snowfields and frozen hedgerows. Peiper's men worked feverishly, transferring gasoline from jerry cans to tanks. The air shimmered with fumes. Somewhere in the distance, an American truck exploded, and a dark column of smoke climbed into the pale sky. In the days to come, the fires of Belgium would burn brighter still. For now, in this fragile calm, Peiper stood motionless, one hand resting on the cold armor of his Tiger tank. Around him, the sounds of engines returning to life rolled through the valley, deep mechanical growls echoing through the frost. His men cheered, but Peiper's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, on the gray expanse leading west toward the Meuse River and a dream that was already dying. He knew the numbers now. 50,000 gallons captured by luck, by desperation, by fate. Enough for a few more days of motion, enough to prolong hope a little longer. But against a world that produced oceans of fuel, against an enemy that could burn millions rather than risk capture, it would never be enough. The snow fell silently as he climbed back into his tank. Somewhere behind him, an engine backfired, startling a flock of crows from the treetops. They rose in a flurry of black wings against the whitening sky. The Ardennes offensive had begun not with thunderous triumph, but with a whisper of futility carried on the cold December wind. December 17th, 1944. Noon had come and gone, yet the sun never truly appeared. The sky hung low over the Ardennes, a heavy shroud of iron-gray cloud pressing down upon the white earth. Snow fell in fine grains that melted on steel, froze on canvas, and stung the faces of men huddled beside armored beasts. The roads westward had turned to black ice. Kampfgruppe Peiper rolled again, its tanks growling to life, exhaust steaming in great ghostly plumes. They moved through villages with names the Germans could barely pronounce. Bulge, Ligneville, Stavelot. Each was a quiet collection of stone cottages and narrow lanes, once peaceful, now trembling beneath the echo of tank treads. In the lead column, Peiper's Tiger tank churned through the drifts, its gun barrel swaying gently with each bump. Inside, the air was thick with oil fumes and tension. The radio hissed and crackled, the voice of headquarters fading in and out. Orders were confused, roads jammed, bridges gone. What had begun as a swift armored thrust was dissolving into a labyrinth of frost and fire. Behind them, the morning sky glowed faintly with the flames of burning trucks. American fuel convoys ambushed and destroyed. Each explosion sent a dull tremor through the valley, a grim echo of the hunger that drove the Germans forward. They were wolves chasing meat, engines drinking greedily from the captured cans stacked in their half-tracks. The men of Peiper's column knew what was at stake. Every liter of fuel they burned was a step closer to victory, or to death by starvation in the snow. Peiper himself rode in silence, his eyes fixed on the map folded across his lap. The Meuse River. That was the line. Reach it, cross it, and perhaps the Allies could be split in two. Fail, and the offensive would bleed out in the woods of Belgium. By mid-afternoon, the lead elements reached the small town of Bulge. There, by sheer fortune, they found another American depot, trucks loaded with fuel and ammunition, their drivers taken by surprise. Peiper ordered immediate capture. His men swarmed the vehicles, tossing jerry cans from one truck to another, shouting in triumph. They had found enough fuel to move another 50 kilometers. Yet victory carried a shadow. In the confusion, a handful of American prisoners were gathered in the town square. The snow around them was churned by boots and tracks. Orders were shouted, conflicting, harsh. Some claimed the prisoners were to be sent east. Others said there was no time, that the column must move on. Peiper stood by his tank, listening, his jaw tight. He said little. The sound of gunfire cracked through the cold air moments later, sharp and final. History would remember what happened at Bulge and later at Malmedy as a stain that could never be erased. But for the men still moving, conscience was buried beneath survival. By evening, Peiper's armored spearhead was deep in enemy territory. Behind them, other German units faltered. Bridges were blown, supply lines stretched thin, and the roads became clogged with their own traffic. Yet Peiper pressed on, his orders clear. Spearhead to the Meuse, no matter the cost. Night fell fast in the Ardennes. Snow thickened into a blizzard, and headlights were doused to avoid detection. The tanks advanced by the dim glow of the moon, their tracks carving deep scars through the frozen fields. Inside their hulls, men sat wrapped in blankets and coats, shivering beside machine guns that had begun to freeze. At a crossroads near Ligneville, a small convoy of American medics appeared, red crosses painted boldly on white trucks. The Germans waved them aside, and the frightened drivers obeyed, disappearing into the forest. In the confusion of war, mercy was a flicker, rare, brief, almost shameful. Through that long night, Peiper's tanks roared westward. They passed wrecked American jeeps half buried in snow, rifles scattered in ditches, and the silent forms of soldiers frozen where they fell. The war had taken on a dreamlike quality. Movement through a world emptied of life. In one captured farmhouse, a soldier named Dieter Kranz found a family's Christmas tree still standing in the corner. The candles had burned to stubs, the small glass ornaments catching the firelight. On the table lay a plate of cookies, untouched. Kranz sat for a moment beside it, his gloves resting on his knees before the call came to move. When he stepped outside again, he could no longer feel his feet. By midnight, the column reached Stavelot. The town lay along the Amblev River, a key crossing point, narrow but vital. The bridge there was intact. Peiper's engineers hurried forward, checking for charges. None were found. For a brief, miraculous moment, it seemed the road to the Meuse might still be open. But fate, once kind, now turned its face away. As the first tanks began to cross, American artillery opened fire from the far hills. The shells screamed overhead, shattering roofs and sending fountains of snow into the night sky. One panzer was hit, its turret torn open like paper. Another slid from the bridge and into the freezing river below, steam rising from its engine as the crew scrambled for their lives. Peiper ordered return fire. The guns of the Tigers roared, the night flashing in violent bursts of orange. The town shook under the duel. Civilians huddled in cellars, clutching rosaries, their prayers drowned beneath the thunder of war. By dawn on the 18th, the bridge was gone, blown apart by retreating American engineers. Stavelot lay in ruins, half the column trapped on the wrong side of the river. Peiper's advance had stalled. He climbed from his tank and stood beside the smoldering wrecks, his breath fogging in the cold. The dream of a swift thrust to the Meuse was fading into smoke. Radio contact with headquarters was patchy. Reports from other fronts spoke of failure. Fuel gone, resistance stiffening, skies clearing. Soon the Allied air power would return, and with it, destruction. Still, Peiper refused to turn back. He gave the order to push north toward Gleize, searching for another bridge, another chance. His men obeyed, weary but loyal, their faces gray with frost and exhaustion. As the column moved again, the landscape grew darker. Burned-out vehicles lined the road, their metal twisted into grotesque sculptures. The snow was stained with soot and blood. Somewhere, a church bell rang, its sound strangely pure amid the chaos. By nightfall, the tanks were low on fuel once more. The captured American gasoline had nearly run out. The gauges quivered near empty, the engines coughing. Peiper knew the meaning of that sound. He had heard it before, and he would hear it again. The German war machine, once unstoppable, was bleeding to death in the Ardennes. He halted the column near a crossroads, setting up a defensive perimeter. Fires were lit in the ditches, their glow flickering across the faces of men too tired to speak. In the distance, tracer rounds drifted lazily through the sky, silent arcs of green and red. Peiper climbed to the top of a small ridge. From there, he could see the faint lights of American positions far to the west. Between them and him stretched 10 miles of snow, broken bridges, and burnt fuel. The Meuse might as well have been the Atlantic. He stood alone for a long time, his breath white in the darkness, and wondered whether the last of Germany's lightning had burned itself out here in this frozen valley beneath a sky that no longer cared who won. The Ardennes lay silent again. Only the low hum of idling engines remained, a dying heartbeat in the cold. December 19th, 1944. The third dawn of the offensive crept over the Ardennes with a bitter stillness. Snow fell in slow, drifting spirals, soft enough to muffle the engines and footsteps that stirred beneath it. Across the valley near Gleize, the tanks of Kampfgruppe Peiper lay scattered and half-buried. Their gun barrels pointed toward a horizon that promised nothing but ruin. Peiper had not slept. He stood beside his Tiger, collar turned against the wind, his gloves blackened with oil. Around him, the remnants of his once mighty column struggled to coax life into frozen engines. Men cursed softly as they beat their hands against their chests, breath steaming in the cold. The smell of gasoline, thin, precious, hung in the air like incense. They were deep in enemy territory now, cut off and surrounded by American forces converging from every direction. To the east, the bridges they had crossed lay in ruins. To the west, the Meuse still shimmered on the maps but was unreachable, a dream swallowed by snow and fuel starvation. The men called it Die Sackgasse, the dead end. From his command half-track, Peiper unrolled a tattered map and studied it in the faint light of dawn. Gleize was a small town, its church spire rising above the white roofs like a finger pointing toward heaven. Around it ran narrow lanes that twisted between stone houses and frozen fields. It would have to serve as a fortress. "Hold here," he had told his officers the night before. "We wait for the rest of the division." But even as he spoke, he knew there would be no relief. The 6th Panzer Army was faltering everywhere. Fuel convoys were ambushed, roads impassable, Allied artillery growing stronger by the hour. Still, a commander could not afford despair. Peiper moved among his men, checking defenses, offering brief words of encouragement. He had the look of a man carved from ice, calm, expressionless, but inside the slow ache of futility gnawed at him. By mid-morning, the first American shells began to fall. They came from the hills to the west, plunging through the snow with dull thuds that shook the earth. The tanks replied, their 88mm guns roaring in defiance. Smoke rolled across the valley. Houses splintered, trees collapsed, and the white ground turned black with soot. In the streets, infantry crouched behind rubble, rifles ready. The air shimmered with heat and frost. Peiper's radio men shouted for ammunition, for fuel, for orders, but the lines were dead. The wireless crackled with static, then silence. In the cellar of a ruined farmhouse, a young SS grenadier named Otto Drexler sat writing in his small notebook. His fingers were stiff with cold, but he pressed on, recording what he could. "We have no fuel left," he wrote. "The tanks are immobile. We fight like infantry now. The Americans surround us." But Peiper still believes. Above him, Peiper watched through binoculars as American Shermans crept along the opposite ridge. Their guns flashed in the gray light, shells shrieking overhead. Each impact sent showers of snow cascading from the roofs. His own tanks answered sluggishly, their crews exhausted, ammunition nearly gone. By afternoon, the Americans closed in. The sound of their engines rolled through the mist like thunder. Infantry in white camouflage advanced through the trees, cautious but relentless. From the church tower, a German machine gun rattled, mowing down the first wave before being silenced by a single shell that tore the steeple in half. The bell crashed down, ringing once, then lay still. Gleize was dying. Inside a shattered tavern, Peiper's officers gathered around a small stove burning scraps of wood and furniture. They spoke in low tones. Some wanted to surrender, others swore to hold. Peiper listened, his face unreadable. "We hold," he said simply, and turned away. Night came early, swallowing the wrecked town in darkness. Snow began again, soft and relentless, covering the bodies in the streets. The wounded cried out for morphine. Medics whispered prayers. Somewhere in the distance, an American loudspeaker called through the night, urging them to give up. No answer came. By the 20th, the last of the fuel was gone. The Tiger tanks stood mute, their engines dead, their tracks frozen to the earth. Peiper walked among them one final time, running his gloved hand across their steel flanks. Once they had been his pride, symbols of strength and momentum. Now they were monuments to futility, iron tombs in the snow. He gathered his officers in the ruins of a farmhouse. The wind howled through the broken windows. "We cannot hold much longer," one said. Another suggested breaking through to the east on foot. Peiper nodded slowly. The choice had already been made in his mind. That night, as the temperature plunged below zero, the men of Kampfgruppe Peiper prepared to abandon their vehicles. They stripped the tanks of their guns, smashed radios, burned papers. The flames licked at the snow, throwing long shadows across the white fields. Each man carried what he could: rifle, rations, a single blanket. At midnight, they began to move. 2,000 men, once the vanguard of the German counteroffensive, slipped silently into the forest, leaving behind 52 tanks, dozens of half-tracks, and the shattered dream of a final victory. The snow muffled their steps. The moon hung pale and distant above the trees. Behind them, Gleize smoldered, a graveyard of machines. In the wreckage of his command tank, Peiper's personal logbook still lay on the seat, frozen stiff. The last entry, written in a firm hand, read simply, "No fuel. Situation hopeless. Withdrawing on foot." For days they moved through the woods, hunted by American patrols. Hunger gnawed at them. Frostbite blackened their fingers. Men collapsed in the snow, too weak to continue. Peiper said little, driving them forward with sheer will. "East," he told them. "Always east." By Christmas Eve, fewer than 800 reached the German lines near Rhine. The rest were captured or lay buried beneath the snow. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge would rage on for another month, but the German advance had already broken upon the icy stones of Gleize. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, once the spearhead of Hitler's last offensive, had been reduced to a foot column of ghosts. For the Americans, it was proof that the Reich's fury was spent. For the Germans who survived, it was the moment they realized the war was truly lost. Back in Gleize, as the new year dawned, villagers emerged from cellars and ruins. They found the silent hulks of tigers half buried in snow, their guns aimed at nothing. The air still smelled faintly of fuel and smoke. Children climbed on the tanks, their laughter echoing through the valley where death had ruled only days before. And there, among those ruins, history settled quietly, like falling snow, covering the last footprints of a doomed army that had fought not for victory, but for the brief illusion of it. December 25th, 1944, Christmas Day in the Ardennes. The snow had stopped, leaving a world of stillness and ash. Smoke drifted from the shattered houses of Gleize, curling upward like the last prayers of a broken town. The guns had fallen silent, replaced by the faint crackle of fires and the slow groan of melting ice. At first light, American patrols entered the valley. The men of the 30th Infantry Division moved cautiously, rifles raised, eyes scanning the empty streets. They expected ambush. Instead, they found silence, thick, eerie, absolute. The first tank they encountered loomed out of the mist like a stranded whale, its armor blackened, its hatch frozen open. Inside, they found nothing but ashes and a single German helmet resting on the seat. As they pushed deeper into the town, they saw the scale of what had been left behind. Dozens of Tiger tanks and Panthers stood nose to tail along the road, engines gutted, tracks broken. Burned trucks lay half buried under snow. A field gun still pointed west, as if stubbornly refusing to accept defeat. Gleize had become a monument to futility. Captain Charles Pritchard, commanding one of the American reconnaissance platoons, later wrote that the scene was like walking into a graveyard of giants. Everywhere he turned, the evidence of desperation was plain. Fuel drums slashed open, maps burned in stoves, boots scattered beside frozen footprints that led into the forest. He picked up a torn fragment of paper caught in a fence. It was a German field order, smudged with grease and snow. Only one line was still legible. Zurück zu Fuß. Return on foot. The Americans realized what had happened. Peiper's force, once the spearhead of the entire 6th Panzer Army, had abandoned their machines and vanished into the woods. In the days to come, hundreds of frozen bodies would be found between Gleize and Rhine, their weapons still clutched in gloved hands. Others, too weak to fight, had surrendered. Yet Peiper himself was gone. He and a remnant of his men, less than 1,000, had slipped through the lines, moving only by night, guided by compass and instinct. They crossed ravines and streams half frozen with ice, crawled through minefields, and evaded patrols by inches. At times, they marched in single file through forests so silent that even the snow seemed to hold its breath. Those who fell behind were left behind. The living could not carry the dead. By New Year's Eve, Peiper staggered into the German lines near Ligneville. His uniform was torn, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He reported to headquarters in a monotone voice, delivering the facts with military precision. 52 tanks lost, more than 2,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The offensive west of the Meuse failed. For all his loyalty, even Peiper could no longer disguise the truth. Germany's last great strike in the West had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet surrender of exhaustion. The Battle of the Bulge dragged on for weeks, but its momentum was broken. The American counteroffensive began with the same relentless energy that had once defined the Blitzkrieg. Columns of Shermans and trucks pushed eastward through the same valleys the Germans had bled across. Supply convoys moved in endless procession, rubber, steel, oil, life itself, rolling toward the front. Fuel, once the lifeblood of the German dream, now flowed freely in rivers of Allied abundance. In the first week of January, engineers arrived to clear La Gleize. They walked among the wrecked tanks, cutting away what could be salvaged. The rest they left to rust. Children from nearby villages scavenged shell casings and badges as keepsakes. Some of the tanks, their hulls too heavy to move, would remain there for decades, their metal slowly merging with the earth. One such tank, a King Tiger, still stands today beside the church of La Gleize, its armor pitted by shell fire, its gun muzzle slightly bent. Beneath the snow, it rests in silence, a relic of pride and ruin. For the villagers who had survived, the war left scars that no thaw could erase. They buried their dead, rebuilt their homes, and tried to forget. Yet each winter, when the first snow fell and the air smelled faintly of diesel and pine, memories stirred. The sight of gray uniforms, the thunder of engines, the fire that lit the night sky red. History, they learned, never truly melts away. In Germany, the defeat in the Ardennes was followed by silence from above. Hitler raged in his bunker, blaming weather, treachery, and fate. But those who had fought knew better. The Wehrmacht had been undone not by cowardice or luck, but by arithmetic. The factories were gone, the oil was gone, and time itself was gone. In the months that followed, the great cities of the Reich would burn: Cologne, Dresden, Berlin, and through the smoke, men like Peiper would come to understand that valor, stripped of reason, becomes only tragedy. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Peiper was taken prisoner by American forces. In his interrogations, he spoke little of the campaign, saying only, "We were ordered to attack, and we attacked." The historian who recorded his statement noted the strange calm in his voice. Not pride, not remorse, but a weary recognition that the age of armored glory had ended in snow and silence. Years later, when asked what he remembered most of the Ardennes, one of his surviving soldiers said softly, "The cold, the endless cold, and how quiet it was when the engines stopped." That silence would outlast them all. Across the Atlantic, the war machine they had failed to halt rolled on, unstoppable. American oil fields pumped without pause, tankers crossed the seas in waves, and in cities untouched by bombs, factories hummed through the night. From those same wells and refineries that had once fueled Patton ES tanks came the energy that would rebuild Europe and power a new world. The fuel that had doomed Peiper's column now became the foundation of peace. And yet, even peace carries echoes. In La Gleize, when the snow begins to fall each December, locals still say that if you walk the old road at dawn, you can hear it faintly. The distant growl of engines, the low rumble of treads moving through fog fading as quickly as it comes. Perhaps it is only the wind across the pines. Or perhaps it is history remembering itself. The Ardennes lies quiet now. The fields that once shook beneath the weight of tanks are green again, dotted with cattle and wildflowers. But beneath the soil lie the bones of men who believed they could change the course of fate with steel and fire. They learned too late that victory in the modern age belonged not to courage or cunning, but to industry, to fuel, to the sheer arithmetic of supply. And so, in the winter of 1944, in that frozen valley called Gleize, the last dream of the Third Reich ran out of gasoline, and history rolled on without it. January 1945. The new year rose bleak and gray over the Ardennes. The fires had burned out, leaving only ash and smoke trailing across the valleys where men once fought for dreams that had already died. The snow returned again, covering the scars of battle, softening the ruins, hiding the bodies that still lay beneath the drifts. The Allied advance moved eastward like a slow tide. Town by town, mile by mile, the Americans reclaimed the ground the Germans had taken in their desperate gamble. Trucks rolled where tanks had once burned. Engineers built bridges over frozen rivers, restoring the veins of supply that had kept them alive. Above, the skies, once closed by weather, were clear again. Squadrons of Thunderbolts and Mustangs streaked overhead, their contrails like white scars across a pale blue sky. For the German army, the retreat became a collapse. What fuel remained was rationed drop by drop. Trucks were abandoned, their engines drained to feed tanks that could no longer move. Columns of infantry trudged eastward through the slush, their boots disintegrating, their breath fogging in the frozen air. Hunger hollowed their faces. The glory of Blitzkrieg had become a long, gray march into surrender. In the villages they passed, civilians watched in silence. They no longer waved, no longer cheered. They had seen too many soldiers come and go, too many promises of victory that ended in ruin. Mothers carried buckets of snow to melt for water. Children searched the ditches for food. The empire that had once stretched across Europe was starving, shrinking with each step its armies took backward. In his temporary headquarters at St. Vith, Peiper wrote his final report. The words were clipped, factual, drained of emotion. He listed the losses: tanks, men, ammunition, fuel, each line a record of failure. At the bottom, he added one sentence: "The attack has failed. The enemy's material superiority is decisive." It was not an excuse, merely an observation, as cold and precise as the snow outside. The generals at higher command read it and said little. They, too, knew the truth. The Ardennes offensive had been a final spasm of hope, born from desperation and denial. Its outcome was never in doubt. For all the courage of the soldiers, it had been doomed by numbers that could not be escaped. The arithmetic of war that always favored the side with more fuel, more steel, more sky. By February, the Americans had crossed the Rhine. The great industrial cities of the Ruhr lay in ruins, their factories silent, their refineries blackened shells. Even if the war had continued another year, Germany could no longer have moved its armies. Without oil, even victory became meaningless. In Berlin, Hitler still raged against the inevitable, pacing in the shadows of his bunker. His maps showed divisions that no longer existed, fuel depots that were empty, armies that could not move. He blamed the weather, the generals, fate itself, anything but reality. But reality had already stripped him bare. The war he had unleashed on the world had consumed his own empire in fire and snow. Far to the west, in the shattered town of Gleize, the thaw began. The villagers returned to their homes, salvaging bricks from the rubble, patching roofs with timber taken from wrecked barns. The great Tiger tanks that Peiper had left behind sank slowly into the softening ground. Children played on their hulls, sliding down the steel flanks that once terrified whole divisions. To them, the war was already a story fading into legend. One of those children, André Léonard, would later grow up to become the keeper of the Gleize Museum, preserving what remained of that frozen week in December. He would tell visitors from distant countries how the tanks had come through his village, how the earth had trembled beneath them, and how the snow had hidden everything afterward. "It was like a storm," he once said, "and then it was gone." For the men who survived it, on both sides, the memory never faded so easily. American soldiers who fought in the Ardennes spoke of the cold, the endless white fields, the strange mixture of fear and pity they felt when they saw the enemy frozen in their tracks. "They looked like us," one veteran recalled, "just boys trying to go home." Among the Germans, those who escaped captivity returned to a country unrecognizable, cities reduced to skeletons, families scattered, faith shattered. Some would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain how it had come to that, how a nation that once believed itself invincible had crumbled into hunger and ashes. In the post-war trials, names like Peiper's resurfaced, not as heroes of armored warfare, but as symbols of something darker. The war crimes committed by his men in Bulge and Malmedy cast long shadows over whatever military reputation he had once possessed. Justice, slow and imperfect, came nonetheless. The reckoning of conscience followed long after the guns went silent. And yet, history rarely deals in absolutes. The story of Kampfgruppe Peiper was not simply one of cruelty or courage, but of a civilization at its breaking point, of a nation that mistook ferocity for strength and willpower for destiny. It is a story written not in glory, but in frost and fire, in the silence of engines that could no longer run. Standing today in that quiet Belgian valley, it is hard to imagine the noise that once filled it, the roar of tigers, the crash of artillery, the shouted orders in German and English alike. The forest has reclaimed its calm. Birds nest in the rusted hulls of tanks. Wildflowers bloom where men once died. Every December, when snow begins to fall, the people of Gleize light candles in their windows. They do not do it to celebrate victory, nor to honor defeat, but to remember what winter once brought them, the sound of war and the fragile peace that followed. Because in the end, the Ardennes was not just a battlefield. It was a mirror. It showed the world, on both sides, what happens when ambition outruns compassion, when faith in power replaces faith in humanity. The snow fell softly that winter, burying the tanks, the bodies, the dreams. And when it melted, spring came again, as it always does. But beneath the green fields of Belgium lies a reminder that every empire, no matter how loud its engines roar, eventually runs out of fuel. The men who fought there are gone now. The forests whisper their stories. The tanks remain, rusted but proud, their silence deeper than any victory speech. And somewhere in that silence, the world remembers how courage can be wasted, how pride can be fatal, and how even the strongest machines fall still when the fire runs dry. That was how the last great German offensive ended, not in triumph, but in silence, not with victory, but with the sound of engines dying in the snow. The end.